Standing on the edge of the sea, Helen was ready to let the tide take her, until Jeff appeared, pulling her back from the brink. Neither of them knew it then, but that night would change both their lives forever. Jeff had always been drawn to the freedom of motorbikes. As a kid, he'd spend countless hours in the garage with his dad, tinkering with engines and learning how every piece fit together. That fascination only deepened with time, and by the time he was a teenager, motorbikes weren't just a hobby, they were a passion. He found himself surrounded by others who shared his love for the open road, forming a tight-knit club of riders. There were no formalities, no rules, just a shared joy of riding together. Now, in his mid-40s, Jeff relied on those gatherings more than ever. Life had thrown him its share of punches. Years of dedicating himself to his demanding job had come at a cost. His marriage crumbled under the weight of neglect, leading to a painful divorce. Worse yet, his relationship with his teenage son had grown distant, leaving Jeff grappling with guilt and loneliness. Seeking a fresh start, he left his old life behind and moved to Cornwall. There, the bike club became more than just a hobby, it was his refuge, a place where he could escape the turmoil of his personal life. On September 19, 1998, the club held their annual barbecue, a lively tradition that marked the end of the riding season. Friends gathered by the dunes, with laughter, food, and the occasional beer passing freely between them. A row of motorbikes stood proudly parked nearby, their polished chrome glinting in the evening sun. For Jeff, this event was more than a party, it was a reminder of the friendships that had carried him through his toughest days. As Jeff, a tall man with broad shoulders and a thick, graying beard, chatted with friends, his attention was drawn to someone unusual. She was standing alone at the edge of the beach. Unlike the others in their swimsuits or casual summer clothes, she wore a heavy denim skirt, a thick sweater, and an oversized overcoat, an odd choice for such a warm evening. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. Something about her struck a chord in Jeff. She looked lost. Curious, Jeff excused himself and walked over. "Hey," he said gently. "Why don't you join us? There's plenty of food and drinks." She glanced at him but said nothing, shaking her head before moving farther down the beach. When Jeff returned to the group, the teasing began, especially from Lenny, his longtime friend and financial advisor. "Looks like you've got your eye on the beachcomber," Lenny said with a smirk. "But she's no bag lady, Jeff, her coat alone is worth more than my bike." "She's troubled," Jeff replied, ignoring the ribbing. "Troubled or not, she's not your problem," Lenny said, throwing an arm around Jeff. "Now, come on, we've got a party to enjoy." And Jeff tried. He laughed at jokes, swapped stories, and clinked beer bottles with his friends. But his thoughts kept drifting back to her. As the sun set and the tide rolled in, he kept glancing toward where she'd been standing, half expecting her to disappear into the dark. When the barbecue finally wound down and the last motorbike rumbled away, Jeff couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He walked through the dunes to find her. She was still there, sitting alone, her silhouette stark against the moonlit waves. She wasn't just lost, she looked like she was waiting for something. Or someone. As Jeff approached, he saw her stand and walk toward the water. The tide had gone out, leaving the beach slick and endless, but the waves still roared as they crashed against the shore. Jeff's stomach twisted when he realized what she was about to do. "Hey," he called, quickening his pace. She didn't turn around. Instead, she waded deeper into the water, the waves splashing against her knees. Without a second thought, Jeff yanked off his jacket and sprinted after her. "Stop," he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the sound of the crashing surf. She didn't stop. By the time Jeff reached her, the water was nearly up to her thighs. She seemed oblivious to him, staring out at the dark horizon. When he grabbed her by the waist, she let out a startled scream and tried to pull away. "Let me go," she yelled, her voice breaking. "I can't do that," Jeff said, tightening his grip as the waves pulled at them both. I'm sorry, but I can't just leave you here. Why do you care? She screamed, thrashing against him. You don't even know me. Jeff's heart broke at the raw pain in her voice, but he held on. Maybe I don't know you, he said, but I know what it's like to feel like you've got nothing left. And I promise, it gets better. You just have to let someone help. For a moment, she froze, her body going limp in his arms. The waves crashed around them, soaking them both to the bone. Jeff held his breath, hoping she'd let him guide her back to shore. I want to die, she screamed, her voice raw and echoing against the crashing waves. If we go any further, we'll both drown, is that what you want? Jeff tightened his grip on her arm and turned her to face him, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. If you go out there, I'll have to try to save you. And I'm not a strong swimmer. We'll probably both drown. Is that what you want, to take me with you? Her tear-filled eyes locked on his. Let me go, she sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her pain. I don't want to live anymore. Jeff's voice softened. Then save my life. Come back to shore with me. Please. Her body shook with deep, gut-wrenching sobs, the kind that made her knees buckle as the tide pulled at their legs. He pulled her into a hug, holding her steady as the waves pushed against them. For a moment, she clung to him like a lifeline. Slowly, he guided her back to the dry sand. She was trembling, her soaked clothes clinging to her. Jeff bent down to pick up his discarded shirt and jeans, wringing them out as best he could. Glancing at her drenched overcoat and sweater, he offered a small, light-hearted comment to break the tension. I think your coat is ruined. The sweater's seen better days too, but maybe the skirt can be saved. She didn't respond, just stared at the sand as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. You should change, Jeff said gently. Before you get too cold. Here, put on my sweatshirt and jeans. I've got a jacket in my truck that I can throw over my swimsuit. The woman looked at him hesitantly before finally nodding. As she reached to unfasten her skirt, she paused. Turn around, please, she said quietly. Of course, Jeff replied, quickly turning his back and giving her space. He stared at the moonlit waves as he waited, listening for any sound of movement behind him, half worried she might try to run back into the water. Okay, she said softly after a moment. Jeff turned to find her dressed in his oversized sweatshirt and jeans, the clothes swallowing her slight frame. She looked vulnerable but no longer on the brink of breaking. Come on, he said, gesturing toward his truck. Let's get you some food. My guess is you haven't eaten in a while. He drove to a small cafe in Padstow, glancing at her from time to time. Her eyes still carried a shadow of pain, but there was a flicker of something else now, a spark of life. The cafe owner, Brian, greeted Jeff with a grin. Haven't seen you in a while, mate. Fish and chips? Jeff nodded. Yeah, and coffee for me. Maybe hot chocolate for the lady? The woman hesitated before murmuring, hot chocolate sounds nice. As Brian prepared their order, Jeff took a moment to wash up in the restroom. When he returned, Helen, she'd finally introduced herself during the short drive, was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug of hot chocolate. People here seem to think a lot of you, Helen said, her voice quieter now, almost curious. Jeff shrugged. Brian's a mate. A frustrated biker at heart. He paused. Wait, what waitress? The place is closed this late. Helen tilted her head, puzzled. The woman who brought the food over. She said you've been a regular here for years. Jeff frowned. That's odd. Brian usually brings it out himself. He decided not to press it further. Instead, he focused on Helen, noticing how the warmth of the cafe and the comfort of food seemed to breathe a bit of life back into her. She still looked fragile, but there was a hint of something more, an ember that hadn't quite burned out. Later that night, Back at his place, Jeff handed her a duvet and gestured toward the couch. "Get some rest. I'll sort out your clothes and make sure they're ready by morning." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As Helen drifted off, Jeff sat by the window with a glass of wine, staring into the darkness. His thoughts turned briefly to his ex-wife, Jackie, but he pushed them aside. Helen's pain wasn't about money or status, judging by her expensive clothes. It was deeper than that. By morning, Helen looked more at ease. Over breakfast, Jeff finally asked, "So, do you want to tell me what led up to last night?" Helen hesitated, her eyes darting away. "I don't want to burden you. You've already done more than enough." Jeff leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Helen, if last night taught me anything, it's that sometimes we all need someone to listen. You don't have to carry this alone." For the first time, Helen held his gaze. And as tears welled up in her eyes again, she began to speak. "I couldn't," Helen admitted, her voice trembling. "I felt worthless and unloved. I ended up here without even thinking. Everything just felt too much." Jeff looked at her gently, his voice steady as he asked, "Do you still feel that way?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around his hands. "I don't know," she murmured. "I don't think so. Not anymore." Helen's voice grew stronger as she met his gaze. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. I owe it to both of us to make the best of it." Jeff nodded, a faint smile breaking through his otherwise solemn expression. "Then we've got a busy day ahead. First, you need clothes. And I think it might help if you talk to Angie, she's someone I trust. She can help." Helen shook her head. "I lost my purse, everything's gone." "Don't worry," Jeff assured her. "We'll figure it out." The morning unfolded slowly. After Helen had borrowed one of Jeff's oversized sweaters and they shared a simple breakfast, she found herself feeling lighter than she had in days. By early afternoon, they'd made their way into town. They stopped at a small boutique, picking out clothes and shoes for her, Jeff staying nearby but giving her space to choose what she liked. By 2 p.m., they were seated at a cozy cafe, sipping coffee and talking over plans for the rest of the day. Jeff had already called Angie, a close friend and lawyer, to arrange a visit. As they chatted, Helen couldn't help but notice Jeff's ease with everyone they encountered. The respect and warmth he seemed to command from those around him left her both impressed and curious. How could a man with so much going for him, confidence, kindness, and generosity, be alone? And why did a shadow of sadness seem to linger behind his smile? Later that afternoon, they arrived at Angie's home. Jeff introduced Helen and then stepped aside, giving her the chance to talk privately with Angie. While they spoke, Helen's mind wandered to Jeff. When he returned, she asked him a question that had been on her mind. "Why do you help people the way you do? It seems like you go out of your way to involve yourself in things most people would ignore." Jeff smiled faintly. "It's not that I look for trouble," he began. "But I can't just stand by when something feels wrong." He paused, then shared a story. There was a young kid, about 17, who was attacked by a group of National Front skinheads. "I went to the police station, but they weren't interested in helping. So, I rode my bike straight at the lot of them. They scattered, but one came back with a knife. I knocked him out with my helmet. Angie here," he added with a nod toward his friend, "sorted things out with the police. Turns out the guy I knocked out was a repeat offender. Why go through all that?" Helen pressed, genuinely curious. Jeff's expression softened. "Because the kid I helped. He told me I was the only person who stood up for him. Sometimes, that's all people need, to know someone's willing to stand up for them." Helen listened quietly, her admiration for him growing. Later that evening, back at Jeff's home, the air between them shifted. After dinner, as they sat together on the couch, Helen leaned forward and kissed Jeff softly on the lips. He froze for a moment, startled, before pulling her onto his lap. They kissed deeply, the connection between them undeniable. When she finally pulled back to catch her breath, she teased him with a playful smile. "Well, that answers one question, you're definitely straight." Jeff blinked in surprise. "Of course I am. Why would you even ask?" Helen shrugged lightly. "No reason. It's just that everyone keeps saying what a wonderful man you are, but there's no woman in your life. I just wondered." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Are you happy now that you know the truth?" "I am," she replied with a grin. Jeff's tone softened. "You were at my mercy last night, Helen. But I would never take advantage of you." Helen's smile faded slightly as she searched his face. "I know," she said quietly. "And I'm grateful for that." There was a pause before she spoke again, her voice tender but determined. "Jeff, I'm not offering my body as some kind of thank you. I'm asking because I want to. You're the most wonderful man I've ever met. My head is a mess right now, but this isn't about gratitude." Jeff hesitated, his own emotions warring inside him. "Helen, I'm flattered, really. But making love, it's important to me. I don't want it to be out of obligation or fleeting feelings. It has to mean something for both of us." Helen was quiet for a moment, digesting his words. "I should feel insulted," she admitted softly, "but I don't." "You're right. This has to mean something." The two sat in silence, their connection deepened not by actions, but by the honesty they had just shared. "Helen, I want you," Jeff said, his voice low but steady. "If I didn't care, I'd have walked away last night. But I didn't, because you matter to me." Tears shimmered in Helen's eyes. "You've been so good to me, Jeff. I don't deserve this, any of this." Jeff cupped her face gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You think this is one-sided? Helen, you gave me the best night of my life, not because of what happened, but because I got to see you smile. You deserve everything I can give you. And more." Her lips trembled before she leaned in, kissing him deeply. When she pulled away, her cheeks were flushed, and she gave him a shy smile. "Thank you." Jeff chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't need to thank me. Now, let's get some breakfast before I'm late for work for the first time since buying the business." They lingered over their morning meal, talking about their plans for the day. Jeff had to head to work, and Helen intended to visit the bank to begin repaying him. But when Jeff returned home that evening, he found Helen pacing the living room, her face pale and her hands wringing together. "The bank refused my request," she blurted out before he could ask what was wrong. "I wanted to start settling my debts, but they said I don't qualify." Jeff crossed the room and took her hands in his, steadying her trembling fingers. "It's okay," he said softly. "This isn't something we have to rush." "I don't want to be a burden to you," she replied, her voice breaking. "You're not a burden, Helen," he assured her. "We'll figure this out together." Helen took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. "I need to wrap up my old life first, Jeff. There are things I need to face before I can move forward." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't the end, it's more like the beginning. If you want it to be." Jeff's chest tightened at her words, but he nodded. "You know what I want," he said quietly. "If getting you back means I have to lose you for a while, then that's what I'll do. I just want you to be okay." That night, they shared one more evening together, their connection deeper and more meaningful than before. Jeff knew her departure was inevitable, but for a few precious hours, they allowed themselves to simply exist in the moment. The next morning, Jeff drove Helen to the train station. The weight of her leaving pressed heavily on his chest, but he kept his composure. They arrived just as the London train pulled away, leaving them an hour to wait for the next one. They sat in silence for a while, watching the comings and goings of the station. Helen finally broke the quiet. "You're an incredible man, Jeff. I don't know how I'll ever repay what you've done for me." "You don't need to repay anything," Jeff said firmly. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. When the train finally arrived, she hugged him tightly, neither of them wanting to let go. "I'll come back," she whispered. "When I'm ready. When I've sorted everything out." Jeff swallowed hard and forced a smile. "I'll be here." He watched as she boarded the train and found a seat, their eyes meeting through the window as the train began to pull away. When she was out of sight, he exhaled heavily and turned back to his truck, feeling the ache of her absence settle deep in his chest. As he drove home, his mind wandered to his past, his marriage, his business, and the betrayal that had led to so much heartache. He remembered the confrontation with Simon and Jackie, the way his world had crumbled in a single conversation. "Strictly business, Jeff. Nothing personal," Simon had said, extending a hand. Jeff had gripped it tightly before landing a punch that echoed all the anger and betrayal he'd bottled up. And yet, standing in the ruins of what he once thought was his life, he'd walked out of the house, determined not to let it destroy him entirely. Now, as he pulled into his driveway, he thought of Helen and the hope she'd brought back into his life. For the first time in a long while, Jeff felt like there was something to look forward to, even if he had to wait for it. Helen's voice was calm yet trembled with emotion as she recounted her story. "I ended up on the beach where I played as a child, the place that used to feel like magic. I don't know why I went there. It didn't bring me any happiness, it just made me miss my parents even more. The tide was going out, and I thought about how fitting it would be to end my empty, meaningless life in a place full of memories that used to bring me joy." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I started walking into the water, further and further. I didn't think about anything except the fact that I didn't want to feel this way anymore. And then, suddenly, she was there." Jeff leaned forward, listening intently. "Who was there?" he asked softly. "I don't know," Helen replied, her eyes distant as she relived the moment. She was about 5 feet 10 inches with long dark hair, and she was just, standing in the water, like she belonged there. She didn't speak, didn't move, but something about her presence stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't explain it then, and I still can't now." Jeff hesitated before speaking. "And then what happened?" Helen gave him a faint smile. "She led me back. Not to shore, but to a small shower near the dunes. She washed my hair, hugged me, and spoke gently, like she knew me. She said, 'You're in shock, but don't worry. I can fix you. You look like you haven't slept in days.' Then she led me to a bedroom, still unclothed, and told me to rest." Jeff's brow furrowed. "That doesn't make sense. Are you saying this wasn't real?" Helen shrugged, her voice barely above a whisper. "It felt real. Every detail. But when I woke up in the darkness, I realized I wasn't in that room. I was somewhere else entirely." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "For a moment, I thought I was back with Jackie. That everything that happened was just a terrible dream. I reached out, and," she trailed off, shaking her head. "But it wasn't Jackie. It wasn't a dream." Jeff waited, giving her space to process. "It was Vanessa," Helen continued, her cheeks flushing slightly. "She pulled me close and kissed me, deeply, but I wasn't ready. I told her I needed to take things slow, and she smiled. She said, 'So that's not a no, just a not now.' She left me to rest, but even then, my mind was spinning." Helen's voice grew quieter. "I slept, but not well. I kept waking up, expecting to find myself back in the water. When morning came, I smelled coffee and saw Vanessa passing by, like none of it had happened." Jeff reached for her hand. "And what happened next?" "She became my anchor for a little while," Helen admitted. "Vanessa believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. She reminded me of my achievements, of the people who'd benefited from my efforts. She made me feel like I mattered again. Her tone grew heavier. But Vanessa always kept me at arm's length. She told me there was no future for us, that our time together was temporary. As the days got shorter, she said she had to leave soon. The night before she left, we talked for hours. She told me I needed to go back and reclaim my life. She said, "You're not a man who gives up. You came here because you weren't in your right mind. Now you can take your life in a new direction." "And did you?" Jeff asked, his voice steady. Helen nodded. That night, we made love, softly, tenderly. It was her way of saying goodbye. The next morning, she was gone, and I returned to the life I'd left behind. Helen's expression turned pensive. When I got back, I realized I'd been away longer than I thought. I'd lost all track of time. People I knew were shocked to see me, and stories from the day my life fell apart were still fresh in the news. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. Jeff raised a brow. "How long had you been gone?" 10 days, Helen replied, shaking her head. I was convinced it was an old newspaper, but everything, the dates on my train ticket, the confirmation from the conductor, all of it matched. She sighed. When I finally called Janet, my secretary, she was relieved to hear from me. She told me how much she'd struggled in my absence, but she stayed because she needed the salary. I promised her I'd help her find a new job, and even decided to give her my car as a thank you for her loyalty. Jeff's eyes softened. "So you picked up the pieces?" "I tried," Helen said quietly. "But part of me still wonders if I'll ever truly put them back together." Jeff squeezed her hand. "You will. And if you need help along the way, you know where to find me." That night, I slept well for the first time in months. It was as if all the chaos of the past few weeks had finally given way to a small measure of peace. The next day, I met with Stuart, my lawyer, signed the necessary documents, and lifted the freeze on my accounts. Stuart, ever pragmatic, suggested I proceed with divorce arrangements. Later that day, I decided to visit Vanessa's house. I needed closure, some kind of explanation for what had happened between us. But when I arrived, I found an empty lot. The house had burned down over a year ago. The local newspaper confirmed that Vanessa and her husband had lived there, but the story was darker than I could have imagined. Her husband had drowned himself, and Vanessa had disappeared. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Vanessa wasn't coming back. Not in the way I'd hoped, and not in any way that could allow for a future together. Still, I couldn't shake the pull I felt toward her memory. I started visiting the beach regularly, feeling an unexplainable connection to that stretch of sand and waves. Eventually, I made a decision that surprised even me. I bought a small house near the beach and an old, struggling motorcycle dealership nearby. Bikes had been a passion of mine since I was young, and diving into something familiar felt like the right way to start over. I spent most of my free time either fixing up the dealership or sitting on that beach, staring out at the waves, waiting for something I couldn't name. I knew Vanessa wouldn't return, but part of me couldn't stop hoping. One day, as Helen and I waited for her train, she turned to me with a thoughtful smile. "Do you think Vanessa brought me to you?" Jeff's eyes widened slightly at the question. "Well," he said, considering her words, "if she did, I owe her my thanks." Helen's voice softened. "Maybe she didn't bring me to you, but she made sure you were there for me. That much I know." The public address system announced Helen's train. We stood together on the platform, stealing a few more moments before she left. When the train pulled in, I kissed her deeply, like a teenager caught up in a whirlwind romance. "Are you really coming back?" I asked, holding her close. "You bet I am," Helen promised, her voice steady. "I have to sort everything out, and I don't know how long it'll take. But as soon as it's done, I'll be back." Weeks passed. One afternoon, as I worked on a bike in the shop, I looked up to see Jackie, my ex-wife, standing in the doorway. Her face looked fuller than I remembered, and her hair was different, but her presence still carried the weight of our shared history. "You're not looking so bad yourself, Jack," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She smirked faintly. "You don't need to flatter me. I know how I look." There was a hint of resignation in her voice. "What brings you here?" I asked. "Was the divorce settlement not enough? You got $250,000 from the house, your company shares, and the lump sum for Ian's child support. Stuart told me you were happy with the arrangement." Jackie sighed, brushing off my defensiveness. "It's nothing like that. You were very fair. All things considered." "Then why are you here?" I pressed. "It's about Ian," Jackie admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "He's been spending more time with Simon. I've tried to stop him, Jeff, really I have. But he's an adult now, and if he wants to change his name," she trailed off, shaking her head. "He still looks up to Simon." "Give him time," I said calmly. "He's still young." Jackie's frustration boiled over. "He's had 7 years. I think that's long enough. What about you?" I asked, steering the conversation toward her. "I gather things didn't work out with Simon." Jackie hesitated, her voice softening as she asked, "Do you remember what you said to me as we walked out the door that last day?" "I do," I replied. "And do you regret it?" she pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes," I admitted. "But way too late." Jackie nodded, her expression sad but resolute. "This isn't about us, Jeff. It's about the company. We want you to come back. We're in trouble, and we need you to lead it again." "You keep saying, 'we,' Jack," I said, suspicion creeping into my voice. "Who's we?" "The board and the bank," Jackie explained. "The company is failing, and we believe you can turn things around. You'd have complete control. You could take the company in any direction you see fit." Before I could respond, I heard laughter outside. 2 red-haired children ran into the house, their small arms wrapping around my legs. "Daddy, why didn't you come swimming with us today?" the little boy asked. I squatted down to his level, smiling softly. "Because I had work to do, little man," I said. But as I hugged them, I felt a new weight in my chest, one that reminded me just how far I'd come, and how much I still had to figure out. Jeff was expecting someone that morning, a visitor from London who had called ahead to let him know they'd be arriving. His son's voice broke the morning quiet. "Is she here now, Daddy?" "Not yet," Jeff replied lightly, ruffling the boy's hair. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Jeff opened it to see Jackie, his ex-wife, standing there, her expression unreadable. "Jackie," he said, his tone neutral. "Were you expecting me today?" she asked, glancing behind him into the house. "You booked your taxi last night, didn't you?" "Someone called to let me know you'd be coming," Jeff said. His voice grew firmer. "Like I've said before, I have real friends here now who care about me." "What's the real reason you're here?" Jackie sighed, brushing past his deflection. "I told you, Jeff. I want you to come back. The company is in trouble." From the laundry room, Helen's voice cut through the tension. "You can't have him back. He's mine now." Jackie ignored her and turned her full attention to Jeff. "We've been made an offer for the company. It's all or nothing. I only own 35% of the shares. Simon and the board need you to come back and guide us through this." Jeff crossed his arms, his tone calm but resolute. "Take the offer, Jack. I'm happy here. I like what I do. Sure, I'm capable of more than selling motorbikes, but that's why I've got my fingers in other pies. Just go home, take the money, and move on." Jackie's eyes welled with tears, but before she could respond, Helen reappeared in the room. Her voice was calm but firm. "Jackie, I'm about to start lunch. Would you like to join us? I'm sure Jeff would be happy to drive you back to town later. Jackie looked between Helen and Jeff, realizing she was fighting a losing battle. She shook her head. No, thank you. I must be going. Thank you for your time, Jeff. Without another word, she walked out the door. Later that afternoon, Jeff sat in his office, reviewing reports on a recent acquisition. His secretary, Janet, announced his next visitor. Miss McAllister is here to see you, sir. Send her in, Janet, Jeff said, leaning back in his chair. And then take your lunch. Helen walked in, a playful smile on her face. Jackie was right about one thing, she teased. That woman's sweet on you. Jeff chuckled. She's a great secretary. That's what matters. Helen's eyes twinkled mischievously. So, I suppose this makes you my boss now? Jeff raised an eyebrow, intrigued. How do you figure that? I have this fantasy about my boss, Helen said, her tone light but suggestive. Where I make a mistake, and he punishes me for it. Jeff leaned forward, playing along. And how does he punish you? I'd leave that to him, sir, Helen replied, her voice dripping with mock innocence. Jeff laughed, shaking his head. Careful, Helen, or you'll start something you can't take back. Helen only smiled, leaned over to plant a quick kiss on his cheek, and left the room. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, the conversation turned to the strange figure who had appeared on the beach months ago, the woman Helen had mentioned, the one who had brought them together. Helen stared out at the horizon, her voice quiet with awe. That was her earlier, wasn't it? The woman from the beach. Jeff nodded slowly. You saw her too? Helen's eyes widened. She was real. I didn't dream her. Jeff's voice was steady but tinged with wonder. If she wasn't real, we both had the same dream. Helen turned to him, a soft smile playing on her lips. I think she was saying goodbye. Maybe she believes we don't need her anymore. Jeff pulled Helen closer, his arms wrapping around her protectively. Then I'll have to take her place. I'll be your guardian angel. Helen rested her head on his shoulder, her voice a gentle whisper. Only if you'll let me be yours, for the rest of our lives. And in the quiet of that moment, they both knew they had finally found the peace they'd been searching for.